Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Rachel, I'm 34, and the first mistake I made at Olympic National Forest was thinking the woods knew my footsteps. The second was believing that little boy was lost. We'd driven the RV up from Portland on a Tuesday in late September, chasing the last warm weather before the Pacific Northwest settled into its long gray sleep. My husband, Mark, had been talking about this trip for months. A chance to disconnect, he said, to remember what silence sounded like. Our marriage had been grinding through one of those rough patches where every conversation felt like stepping on broken glass, and we both hoped the forest might smooth our edges. The Hoh River campground sat deep in the temperate rainforest, where ancient Sitka spruces and western hemlocks grew so thick they swallowed sunlight whole. We'd reserved Site 14, tucked back from the main loop where the road curved toward the river. Mark backed our 30-foot Winnebago between two moss-draped giants, their trunks so wide 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. "Jesus," Mark breathed, cutting the engine. "It's like parking inside a cathedral." He wasn't wrong. The trees rose impossibly high, their canopy lost in green shadow. Moss hung everywhere like tattered curtains, muffling sound until even our voices seemed small. The air tasted of damp earth and decomposing leaves, rich and loamy in a way that made you want to fill your lungs. "No cell service," I said, checking my phone. The screen showed a single dead bar. "Good." Mark was already climbing out, stretching muscles cramped from the 6-hour drive. "That's the whole point." I wanted to argue. What if something happened? What if we needed help? But I bit back the words. This trip was supposed to fix things, not start another fight. So I smiled and helped him level the RV, connect the power, and extend the awning over our picnic table. By evening, we'd settled into the rhythm of camp life. Mark grilled burgers on our portable grill while I arranged folding chairs around a small fire ring. The other campsites were scattered and quiet. A young couple with a pup tent 2 sites over, an elderly man with a small travel trailer across the loop, and maybe 3 other RVs spread throughout the campground. The kind of peaceful I'd forgotten existed. "Listen," Mark said as we ate. He held up a hand, head tilted. I listened. Nothing. Not a car engine, not a voice, not even a bird. Just the distant whisper of the Hoh River threading through the trees and the soft pop of our campfire. "When's the last time you heard actual quiet?" he asked. I had to think. I can't remember. That first night we went to bed early. The RV's bedroom felt smaller somehow, pressed in by all that ancient wood and shadow. I lay awake, listening to Mark's breathing deepen while rain started pattering on the roof. The kind of gentle, persistent rainfall the Olympics were famous for. It should have been soothing, but something about the darkness beyond our windows made me pull the covers tighter. I must have slept, because I woke to sunlight filtering green through the trees and the smell of coffee from the kitchenette. Mark was already up, standing at the window with his mug. "There's a kid out there," he said. I joined him at the window, following his gaze. Across the campground, maybe 50 yards away, a small figure stood perfectly still between 2 massive tree trunks. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing what looked like a red jacket or sweater. Even from this distance, I could see he was staring directly at our RV. "Whose is he?" I asked. Mark shrugged. "Must belong to one of the other campers, probably just curious about the big RV." But something felt off. The boy wasn't moving, wasn't fidgeting the way kids do. He just stood there, motionless as the trees themselves. "How long has he been there?" I asked. "I just noticed him. Maybe a few minutes." I watched for another moment, waiting for the boy to wave or run back to his parents or do something. Anything. He didn't. "I'm going to get dressed," I said, stepping away from the window. When I looked again 10 minutes later, he was gone. We spent that day hiking the Hall of Mosses Trail, a short loop that wound through some of the most pristine temperate rainforest in North America. The massive trees were draped in club moss and licorice fern, creating chambers of green light that felt more cathedral than wilderness. We barely spoke, both of us awed by the sheer ancientness of the place. These trees had been growing when Europe was burning witches, when my ancestors were crossing oceans in wooden ships. They made our marital troubles feel small and temporary. On the way back to camp, I noticed Mark kept glancing over his shoulder. "What?" I asked. "Nothing. Just thought I heard something." I listened but heard only our footsteps on the soft trail and the distant drip of moisture from branch to branch. The forest had a way of playing tricks with sound. You'd think you heard voices or footsteps, but it would just be water dripping or a branch creaking in the breeze. That evening, we built another fire and opened a bottle of wine. The other campers had mostly kept to themselves, though the elderly man across the loop, Bob, he'd introduced himself, had stopped by to chat about fishing spots on the river. He seemed nice enough, a retired teacher from Spokane who'd been coming here for 20 years. "Peaceful place," he'd said, "but it keeps its secrets." I'd asked what he meant, but he'd just smiled and changed the subject. Now, with the wine warming my blood and the fire crackling between us, I felt the closest to content I'd been in months. Mark reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand. "This was a good idea," I said. "Yeah." He squeezed my fingers. "We should do this more often." That's when we heard it. A voice, high and clear, cutting through the evening air. "Hello." We both turned toward the sound. There, maybe 30 feet from our fire, the boy stood again. Up close, I could see he was young, maybe 6 instead of 8, with pale skin and dark hair that looked like it needed a good brushing. His red jacket was actually a sweater, oversized and worn. "Hi there," Mark called back. "Are you camping here with your family?" The boy didn't answer. He just stood there, hands at his sides, staring at us with wide, dark eyes. There was something unsettling about his stillness, the way he didn't blink or fidget or do any of the things children normally do. "What's your name?" I tried. Nothing. Mark stood up, and the boy took a step back. "Hey, it's okay," Mark said gently. "We just want to make sure you're not lost. Where are your parents?" The boy tilted his head like a dog hearing a distant whistle. Then, without warning, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that makes you take a step back. Too wide, showing too many teeth, lasting too long. Like he'd just remembered how smiling worked but couldn't quite get it right. "They're sleeping," he said finally, his voice carrying an odd sing-song quality. Deep sleeping. Something cold crawled up my spine. "Where's your campsite, honey?" The boy raised one small hand and pointed into the trees, into the deep forest where no camping was allowed, where there were no trails, no clearings, just endless dark between the massive trunks. "In there," he said. That unsettling smile never wavered. Mark and I exchanged glances. Kids got confused about directions, sure, but this felt different. Wrong. "I think maybe you should come with us," Mark said carefully. "We can help you find your mom and dad." The boy's head tilted the other way, like he was considering the offer. Then he shook his head. "They don't like strangers," he said, "but they like me. I'm special." He turned and walked back toward the trees, moving with a strange, fluid gait that didn't quite look right for a child his age. We watched him disappear into the forest, swallowed by shadows and moss-draped branches. "Should we follow him?" I asked. Mark stared at the spot where the boy had vanished. "I don't know. Maybe we should tell Bob about it, or the camp host." But we didn't. We sat by the fire for another hour, finishing the wine and trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. Kids were weird. Maybe he was playing some kind of game. Or his parents were the type who let him roam free in the wilderness. People raised their children differently. Still, I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see that pale face watching us from the shadows. That night, I dreamed of walking through the forest. I was looking for something, or someone, following a sound that might have been crying or might have been singing. The trees grew thicker as I walked, their trunks pressing closer together until I had to turn sideways to squeeze between them. The sound grew louder, more urgent, but I could never quite reach it. I woke to find Mark shaking my shoulder. "Rach, wake up!" "What?" I sat up, disoriented. The RV was dark except for the red glow of the clock, 3:17 a.m. Listen. I held my breath and listened. At first, nothing. Then I heard it. A soft, scratching sound like fingernails on wood. It was coming from outside, somewhere near the door. Probably just a raccoon, I whispered, but my voice shook. The scratching stopped. In the silence that followed, we heard something else. Humming. A child's voice, tuneless and wandering, drifting around the outside of our RV. Mark grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. I'm going to look. Don't. I caught his arm. Just leave it. Whatever it is, just leave it. But he was already moving, padding to the front of the RV in his boxers. I followed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mark peered through the curtained windshield, angling his phone light toward the sounds. I don't see anything, he whispered. The humming grew louder, circling our RV like a shark around a boat. Then it stopped, and in the sudden silence we heard a small voice. Rachel. Mark. My blood turned to ice water. We hadn't told the boy our names. Come out and play. Mark's hand found mine in the dark. His palm was slick with sweat. We should call for help, I breathed. With what? No cell service, remember? The voice came again, closer now, right outside our bedroom window. I know you're awake. I can smell you breathing. This time, the words carried a weight that made my knees weak. The voice was still high and childlike, but there was something underneath it. Something old and hungry and patient. We stayed frozen by the window until dawn, listening to the boy circle our RV and call our names in that sweet, terrible voice. Sometimes he hummed. Sometimes he whispered things I couldn't quite make out but didn't want to understand. When the first gray light finally filtered through the trees, the sounds stopped. Mark pulled the curtain aside and looked out. Nothing. Just empty forest and morning mist. We're leaving, he said. I wanted to argue. We'd paid for 4 nights, driven all this way, needed this time together. But the words died in my throat when I saw what was scratched into the dirt around our RV. Symbols, carved deep into the earth in perfect circles. They looked almost like letters, but from no alphabet I recognized. Pack everything, Mark said. Now. We broke camp in record time, throwing gear into storage compartments and collapsing the awning with shaking hands. The other campers were still asleep, their sights quiet and peaceful. I envied them their ignorance. As Mark started the engine, I saw Bob emerge from his trailer across the loop. He waved, then noticed we were packing up. His expression changed, and he hurried over. Leaving early? He called through Mark's open window. Yeah, something came up, Mark lied. Bob studied our faces, then glanced at the symbols scratched in the dirt. His own face went pale. You saw him, didn't you? He said quietly. The boy. My stomach dropped. You know about him? Bob looked around, making sure we were alone. Been coming here 20 years. Seen him maybe a dozen times. Always the same. Young boy in a red sweater, asking strange questions, knowing things he shouldn't. What is he? I whispered. Don't know. Don't want to know. Bob stepped back from the RV. But I'll tell you this. The families that talk to him, that invite him close, they don't usually finish their camping trips. What do you mean? Mark asked. 3 years ago, a couple from Seattle had a little girl about the boy's age. He started showing up at their campsite wanting to play. They thought it was sweet, how he seemed so lonely. Found their RV empty the next morning. All their gear still there, food still cooking on the stove. Never found the bodies. My hands were shaking so hard I had to clasp them together. Last year, Bob continued. A family of 4. Same thing. Boy starts visiting. Parents think he's just a lost kid from another campsite. They disappeared one by one. First the father, then the mother, then the 2 children. Rangers found the youngest boy's shoes by the river. But that's all. Why don't the Rangers do something? Mark demanded. Bob laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do what? Post signs warning about ghost children. They've had experts out here. Psychologists, paranormal investigators, even a priest once. Nobody can explain it, so they just don't talk about it. Through the windshield, I caught movement in the trees. A flash of red between the trunks. There and gone. "He's watching us," I said. Bob followed my gaze and paled further. "You need to leave. Now. And whatever you do, don't stop until you're back on the highway." Mark didn't need to be told twice. He threw the RV into drive and we lurched forward, tires spinning on the damp gravel. In the passenger mirror, I watched Bob disappear behind us, and beyond him, barely visible in the shadows, a small figure in a red sweater. We drove in silence for the first 10 miles, both of us gripping our seats as the narrow forest road wound through the trees. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see the boy running behind us with that impossible smile, but there was nothing except ferns and moss and the endless colonnade of ancient trees. "We're okay," Mark said finally, his voice tight. "We're out." That's when the engine died. We coasted to a stop on a lonely stretch of road, miles from the nearest house or business. Mark turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click from the starter. "Shit," he breathed. He popped the hood and climbed out to investigate. I stayed in the passenger seat, watching the trees press close to the road. The forest felt different here. Older, hungrier. The trees seemed to lean in, their moss-draped branches reaching across the asphalt like grasping fingers. "I can't find anything wrong," Mark called from under the hood. "Everything looks fine." That's when I saw him. The boy stood just inside the tree line, maybe 20 feet away. He wasn't looking at Mark. He was looking at me, his head tilted at that unnatural angle, that too wide smile splitting his pale face. "Mark," I whispered. "What?" "Get back in here, now." Something in my voice made him drop the hood and hurry back to the driver's seat. He followed my gaze and went rigid. "How did he?" "We left him miles back." The boy stepped out of the trees and onto the road. Up close, in daylight, I could see details that made my skin crawl. His red sweater was old, the kind of wool garment you might find in a thrift store or a grandmother's closet. It was too big for him, hanging loose on his small frame. But it was his eyes that really got to me. Dark and deep and far too knowing for a child's face. "Hello, Rachel. Hello, Mark." His voice carried clearly through the windshield. "Your car won't start." It wasn't a question. Mark turned the key again. Nothing. The boy walked closer, his movements fluid and wrong. Children bounced when they walked, full of restless energy. This boy glided like he was floating just above the ground. "I told you they don't like strangers," he said conversationally, "but I convinced them to let you stay. They're curious about you." "Who?" Mark's voice cracked. "Who's curious?" The boy pointed into the forest with one pale finger. "My family. They've been sleeping so long, but you woke them up. They want to meet you." I looked where he pointed and felt my sanity slip a notch. There were shapes moving between the trees, tall, shadow-dark figures that seemed to flow rather than walk. They stayed just at the edge of visibility, but I could feel their attention like ice water in my veins. "We just want to leave," I said through the window. "Please, we won't tell anyone about this place." The boy's smile widened impossibly. "But you're family now. I chose you. That means you stay." He pressed his small hands against the passenger window, and I saw something that made me scream. His palms were wrong, too long, the fingers ending in points like claws. And his eyes, God, his eyes weren't human anymore. They were black from lid to lid, reflecting nothing. Mark tried the engine again. This time it turned over, coughing to life with a sound like grinding bones. "Drive!" I screamed. Mark floored it. The RV lurched forward, and for a moment I thought we'd hit the boy, but he simply stepped aside, moving faster than any child should be able to move, and watched us with that horrible smile as we roared past. I watched him in the mirror until a curve in the road took him from view. But I swear I could still feel those black eyes following us, patient and hungry. We drove without stopping until we reached the main highway, then pulled into the first gas station we found. Mark's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the gas pump. I tried my phone and nearly cried with relief when I saw full bars. "We should call the police," I said. "And tell them what? That a creepy kid with magic powers tried to kidnap us?" He was right. Who would believe us? We'd sound insane. What about Bob? We should warn him. Mark was quiet for a long moment. Maybe, but he's been going there for 20 years. He knows the risks. We drove home in relative silence, both of us jumping at every shadow, every child's voice in a parking lot. The rational part of my mind kept trying to explain what we'd experienced. Hallucinations brought on by stress, carbon monoxide from a faulty heater, some kind of shared psychotic break. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. That was 3 months ago. Mark and I never did fix our marriage. How could we? How do you go back to worrying about whose turn it is to take out the trash when you've looked into the abyss and seen it smile back? He moved out last month. I don't blame him. Living with me now is like living with a ghost. Because here's what I haven't told anyone. What I can't tell anyone. The boy found me. It started small. I'd catch glimpses of red in my peripheral vision, gone when I turned to look. Children's laughter from empty rooms. My name whispered in the walls of my apartment late at night. Last week, I found muddy footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom. Small prints, like a child might make. They stopped at the foot of my bed. Yesterday, I came home to find a drawing taped to my refrigerator. A crayon sketch of a woman with long dark hair standing next to a tall man, both of them smiling. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, "My new family." I'm writing this down because I don't think I have much time left. The whispers are getting louder, and sometimes when I look in the mirror I see a small figure in a red sweater standing behind me. He's patient, but not infinitely so. Tonight I heard him clearly for the first time since the forest. He was in my bedroom, singing a lullaby I half remembered from childhood. Come and play, come and stay, deep in the forest where we lay. Close your eyes, don't you cry. Soon you'll be family, by and by. I'm not going to run. There's no point. You can't outrun something that isn't entirely real, something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. The boy chose me in that ancient forest, marked me as his own. Now he's come to collect. So if anyone finds this, if anyone reads these words, remember, some places are better left undisturbed. Some children are better left unfound. And if you ever find yourself camping in the deep woods and see a small boy in a red sweater watching you from the trees, whatever you do, don't smile back. Don't invite him closer, and never, ever tell him your name. The whispers are getting louder now. He's calling for me, his voice sweet and patient and wrong. I can hear my door opening, small feet on the hardwood floor. He's coming to take me home, back to his family in the endless green cathedral where the trees remember everything and the shadows never let go. I should be afraid, but mostly I just feel tired. So very tired of running from something I can never escape. He's at my bedroom door now. I can see his silhouette in the hallway, backlit by the kitchen light. He's smiling that impossible smile, and his black eyes reflect nothing. Nothing at all. "Hello, Rachel," he says, and his voice is the sound of wind through dead leaves, of children crying in empty houses, of promises that should never be kept. It's time to come home. Story 2. I'm Sarah. I'm 34. I came to Gifford Pinchot National Forest to scatter ashes, and the wind brought someone back. The RV rental place in Portland had assured me their 32-foot Winnebago could handle the forest roads, though the pimpled teenager behind the counter kept glancing at the urn I clutched against my chest like he'd never seen grief made portable. I should have taken that as a warning, should have listened when he mumbled something about checking the weather and maybe waiting a few days. But I'd already waited 3 months since Mom died. 3 months of that ceramic vessel sitting on my kitchen counter like an accusation, and I couldn't wait anymore. The drive east on Highway 14 along the Columbia River was beautiful enough to make me forget, temporarily, why I was making this trip. Fall had painted the gorge in shades of rust and gold, and the river caught the afternoon light like hammered copper. But as I turned north into the forest proper, following the winding road toward Iron Creek Campground, the trees pressed closer, and the light grew thin and gray between the Douglas firs. Mom had loved this place. We'd come here every summer when I was a kid, before Dad left, before the cancer, before everything good got stripped away piece by piece. She'd always said she wanted her ashes scattered at Rift Lake, the little alpine tarn we'd hiked to when I was 12. It's where I feel closest to something bigger than myself, she told me that last day in the hospital, her voice barely a whisper. Promise me, Sarah, when it's time. I'd promised, of course. What else do you do when your mother is dying? Iron Creek Campground was nearly empty. Just me and maybe 3 other RVs scattered among the sites like lonely islands. The season was over, the ranger explained when I checked in. A weathered woman in her 50s with eyes the color of old pennies, she looked at my rig with the same skeptical expression as the rental kid. You planning to stay long? She asked, glancing at the darkening sky. Weather Service is calling for a storm system moving in tonight. Could get nasty. Just a couple days, I said. I'm hiking up to Rift Lake. Something shifted in her expression, a tightening around those copper eyes. Rift Lake? You sure about that? My mother and I used to hike there. I'm scattering her ashes. The ranger's face softened immediately. Oh, honey, I'm sorry for your loss. It's just, well, it's late in the season. That trail can be tricky when the weather turns. You experienced? I wasn't, really. A few day hikes around Mount Hood, some walks along the Sandy River. Nothing that qualified as experienced, but I nodded anyway. I'll be fine. She studied me for a long moment, then shrugged. Site 14 is yours. There's firewood available and the bathhouse is just down the road. If you need anything. She handed me a card with the ranger station number. Don't hesitate to call. Site 14 sat at the edge of the campground, backed up against a wall of old-growth forest that seemed to swallow sound. I managed to get the RV level after 20 minutes of adjusting the jacks. Mom would have been proud. She'd been the practical one, the one who knew how to make things work. I was the dreamer, the English teacher who lived in her head and had never learned to change a tire. The first sign that something was wrong came when I was setting up the small camp chair Mom had loved, the one with the cup holder and the faded University of Oregon logo. A creek ran behind my site, maybe 30 feet into the trees. I could hear it babbling over rocks, a sound that should have been soothing. But when I walked back to look at it, to see if it was the same creek we'd followed to the lake all those years ago, I caught sight of my reflection in a still pool near the bank. It was me, certainly. Same shoulder-length brown hair, same dark eyes that never looked quite happy anymore, same thin face that had gotten thinner in the months since Mom died. But something about the reflection seemed delayed, like it was running a half-second behind my movements. When I raised my hand to wave, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself, the reflection raised its hand a beat later, and for just an instant, I could have sworn it smiled when I hadn't. I stepped back from the water quickly, telling myself I was tired, stressed, seeing things. The 6-hour drive from Portland would make anyone's eyes play tricks. I returned to the RV and busied myself with dinner. A can of soup heated on the tiny stove, eaten while standing at the narrow counter and staring out the window at the darkening forest. The storm the ranger had mentioned arrived just after sunset, bringing with it a wind that made the RV rock gently on its jacks. Rain drummed against the aluminum roof in waves, sometimes soft as fingertips, sometimes hard as thrown pebbles. I tried to read, a mystery novel I'd started months ago, but the words kept blurring together. Instead, I found myself staring at the urn on the small dining table, its blue ceramic surface reflecting the overhead light. "I'm going to do it tomorrow, Mom," I said aloud, feeling only slightly ridiculous. "Weather permitting. The lake is about 4 miles up the trail, if I remember right. I'll find that spot where we had lunch, where you said the water looked like liquid sky." The wind gusted harder, shaking the RV, and for a moment I thought I heard something else in the storm. A voice, maybe, calling my name. But when I pressed my ear to the window, there was only rain and the distant sound of the creek. I went to bed early, but sleep came in fragments. Every time I started to drift off, the RV would creak, or the wind would howl, or I'd hear what sounded like footsteps in the gravel outside. Once, around 2 in the morning, I was sure I heard someone knocking, 3 soft raps on the door. I lay frozen in the narrow bed, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the blinds, the campsite was empty except for rain falling through the circle of light cast by my porch lamp. Morning came gray and wet, but the storm had passed. I made coffee with the RV's tiny coffee maker and stood at the door, breathing air that smelled like pine resin and wet earth. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more like the place I remembered from childhood. Birds called from the trees, and I could see a squirrel working industriously at something near the picnic table. The creek behind my site had risen during the storm, and the little pool where I'd seen my strange reflection was now a rushing torrent of brown water carrying twigs and leaves downstream. I told myself I was relieved not to have to look at it again. After breakfast, I packed my day pack with water, snacks, a rain jacket, and, most importantly, the urn. It fit snugly in the main compartment, wrapped in one of Mom's old sweaters for protection. The familiar smell of her perfume still clung to the wool, faint but unmistakable, and I had to stop for a moment to compose myself. The trailhead was about a mile north of the campground, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, Rift Lake Trail, 4.2 miles. The number painted on the sign looked fresh, like someone had recently updated it, though the wood underneath was gray with age. I shouldered my pack, checked that I had my phone, though there was no signal this deep in the forest, and started walking. The first mile was easy, a gentle climb through second-growth forest, the trail well-maintained and clearly marked. I passed a family of day hikers heading down, a couple with 2 young boys who reminded me painfully of myself at that age, all excitement and boundless energy. They warned me about muddy conditions higher up, but said the lake was totally worth it. The second mile was where things started to change. The trail grew steeper and more rugged, winding through stands of old-growth fir and cedar that blocked out most of the sky. The air grew thin and sharp, carrying scents I couldn't identify, something sweet and cloying underneath the usual forest smells. I stopped frequently to rest and drink water, unused to the altitude and the physical exertion. It was during one of these rest stops, maybe 2.5 miles in, that I first noticed the creek. The trail had been following a small stream for the last half mile, crossing it several times on fallen logs or simple plank bridges. But this time, when I knelt beside the water to splash some on my face, I saw my reflection again. And again, something was wrong. This time, it wasn't the timing that bothered me. It was the expression. My reflection was smiling, a wide, bright smile that made my face look strange and unfamiliar. But I wasn't smiling. In fact, I was frowning with concentration as I tried to figure out what I was seeing. I jerked my hand back from the water and stood up quickly, my heart hammering. When I looked again, the reflection was normal, my own worried face staring back at me from the dark water. I must have been mistaken, I told myself. The angle of the light, maybe, or a trick of the moving water. But as I shouldered my pack and continued up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that my reflection had been looking at something I couldn't see. The third mile brought me into alpine country. Sparse trees, rocky outcroppings, and patches of snow in the shadowed areas despite the relatively mild October weather. My breath came in visible puffs, and I had to stop more frequently to rest. The trail was harder to follow here, marked only by occasional cairns and worn spots in the rocky ground. It was also where I started hearing the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the sparse trees, or maybe other hikers somewhere ahead of me on the trail. But as I stopped to listen, the sounds resolved into something more distinct. People talking, though I couldn't make out words. A conversation, maybe even laughter, coming from somewhere up ahead. I felt a surge of relief. Other people meant safety, companionship, someone to share the beautiful views with. I picked up my pace, eager to catch up with whoever was ahead of me. But no matter how fast I walked, the voices always seemed to be just around the next bend, just over the next rise. And gradually, I began to recognize something familiar in the rhythm of the speech, the cadence of the laughter. One of the voices sounded like mine. I stopped walking, my breath coming hard from the exertion and the altitude. The voices continued for a moment, then faded away into the wind. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, listening. but heard nothing except my own heart beating and the distant sound of water running over rocks. "Altitude sickness," I said aloud, my voice small and strange in the thin air. "That's all. You're not used to this." But I knew it wasn't altitude sickness. I'd read about that. Headaches, nausea, difficulty breathing. This was something else entirely. The final push to Rift Lake was the hardest part of the hike, a steep scramble over loose rock and through patches of snow that had probably been there since the previous winter. By the time I crested the final ridge and saw the lake spread out below me, I was exhausted, shivering, and beginning to question my decision to make this trip alone. But the lake was exactly as I remembered it. A perfect oval of dark water surrounded by granite cliffs and a few wind-twisted pines. The place where Mom and I had eaten lunch that day 22 years ago was still there. A flat rock outcropping on the eastern shore with a clear view across the water to the peaks beyond. I made my way carefully down the rocky slope to the shore, then around to our old lunch spot. The rock was dry despite the previous night's rain, warmed by the afternoon sun that had finally broken through the clouds. I sat down, pulled the urn from my pack, and unwrapped it from Mom's sweater. "Well, we made it," I said, running my hands over the smooth ceramic surface. "Just like you wanted." The lake was perfectly still, its surface like black glass. Too still, maybe. I couldn't see any fish rising, no insects skating across the surface, no ripples from the wind that I could feel moving through the sparse trees around the shore. It was beautiful, but in a way that felt almost artificial, like a painting rather than a real place. I stood up, unscrewed the top of the urn, and walked to the water's edge. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for 3 months. The final goodbye. "I love you, Mom," I whispered and tilted the urn. The ashes poured out in a gray stream, floating on the still water for a moment before beginning to disperse. Some sank immediately. Others drifted in swirling patterns across the surface. I watched until the last visible traces had disappeared, then sat back down on the rock and let myself cry for the first time since the funeral. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the sun to move noticeably across the sky, for the air to grow cold despite the sunshine. I was just thinking I should start the hike back down when I heard my name called from across the lake. "Sarah!" I looked up, wiping my eyes, and saw a figure standing on the far shore, maybe a quarter-mile away, too far to make out details, but it appeared to be a woman in dark clothing, waving at me. "Sarah!" the voice called again, and this time I was sure. It was my mother's voice. I stood up so quickly I nearly lost my balance on the slippery rock. The figure across the lake was still there, still waving. I raised my hand and waved back, my heart pounding. "Mom?" I called, though I knew it was impossible. Impossible and insane and everything I'd been taught not to believe in. The figure stopped waving and began walking along the shore toward me. Even at that distance, I could see the familiar way she moved. The slight hitch in her left leg from an old skiing accident. The way she held her shoulders a little too straight. It was Mom. Somehow, impossibly, it was Mom. I started around the lake toward her, stumbling over rocks and patches of snow in my haste. But the shoreline was treacherous, all loose scree and hidden crevices, and I had to move slowly to avoid falling. By the time I reached the place where I thought I'd seen her, there was no one there. "Mom!" I called out, my voice echoing off the granite cliffs. "Mom, where are you?" Only the echo answered me. I searched the area for maybe 20 minutes, calling her name, looking behind every boulder and stand of trees. But there was no one there. And more importantly, there were no footprints in the muddy spots along the shore, no broken branches or disturbed rocks to indicate that anyone had passed that way. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, I finally accepted that I'd been seeing things. Grief hallucinations, maybe, or altitude sickness after all. I made my way back to my pack, shouldered it, and started the long hike down. The descent should have been easier than the climb up, but my legs were shaky from exhaustion and emotion, and I had to be careful not to slip on the wet rocks. The trail seemed different somehow. Longer, more confusing. Twice I had to backtrack when I realized I'd lost the path, and by the time I reached the easier terrain of the lower forest, it was getting dark. That's when I started hearing the voices again. This time, they were clearer, more distinct, a conversation between two people, one of whom was definitely me. I could hear my own voice talking about the weather, about the difficulty of the hike, about how beautiful the lake had been. But I wasn't speaking. I was walking alone through the forest, my mouth closed, listening to myself have a conversation with someone else. The ashes looked like snow on the water, my voice was saying. I think she would have liked that. She did like it, another voice replied, and my blood went cold. It was my mother's voice, as clear and real as if she were walking beside me. She's very proud of you for keeping your promise. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The voices continued for a moment, then faded away into the sound of wind in the trees. "This isn't real," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "This isn't happening." But even as I said it, I could hear them again. Fainter now, but still audible. My voice and my mother's voice, having a conversation I wasn't part of. I started walking faster, almost jogging down the trail despite the growing darkness. I needed to get back to the RV, back to something solid and real and familiar. I needed to get out of these woods. The last mile of trail seemed to stretch on forever, but finally I saw the lights of the campground through the trees. Never had anything looked so welcoming as those scattered RV windows glowing like beacons in the darkness. I practically ran the final 100 yards to my site, fumbling for my keys as I approached the door. The RV was exactly as I'd left it. Door locked, windows intact, no signs that anyone had been there. I let myself in, turned on every light, and sat down at the small table with my head in my hands. Grief, I said to myself. It's just grief. People see things, hear things. It's normal. It's psychological. I heated up another can of soup for dinner, though I wasn't hungry. I needed the routine, the normalcy of it. As I stood at the stove stirring the soup, I caught sight of my reflection in the dark window, and froze. My reflection was stirring soup, just like I was. But in the reflection, there was someone else in the RV. A woman sitting at the table behind me, watching me cook. A woman with graying hair and tired eyes and a familiar blue sweater. I spun around. The table was empty. When I looked back at the window, my reflection was alone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard voices. My mother's voice, my own voice, sometimes others I didn't recognize. I heard footsteps on the gravel outside, gentle tapping on the windows, the sound of someone trying the door handle. But whenever I worked up the courage to look, there was never anyone there. As dawn broke gray and cold over the campground, I made a decision. I was leaving. Whatever was happening to me, grief, altitude sickness, some kind of psychological breakdown, I needed to get back to civilization, to doctors and sanity and rational explanations. I broke camp quickly, stuffing everything into the RV without my usual care for organization. I just wanted to be gone, to put miles between myself and this place. As I was securing the last of my gear, I heard a voice call my name from the direction of the creek. I didn't look. I started the engine, put the RV in gear, and drove away without looking back. But as I pulled out of the campground, I caught a glimpse of my side mirror. There was someone in the passenger seat of the RV. A woman in a blue sweater, smiling and waving goodbye to something I couldn't see. I jerked the wheel so hard I nearly drove into a tree. When I looked again, the seat was empty. The drive back to Portland should have taken 4 hours. It took me 7, because I had to stop every few miles to get out and walk around, to convince myself that I was alone in the RV, that there was no one in the passenger seat, or the bed, or the bathroom. By the time I reached the rental place, I was exhausted and shaking, barely coherent. The same pimpled teenager was working, and he looked concerned as I stumbled through the return process. "You okay, lady?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I started laughing at that, a high, desperate sound that scared even me. "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, I think maybe I did. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm back in my apartment in Southeast Portland now, back to teaching 9th grade English and grading papers and living what passes for a normal life." I've seen a doctor, a therapist, even a neurologist. They've run tests, prescribed medication, used words like complicated grief, and stress-induced hallucinations. But every morning when I brush my teeth, I watch my reflection carefully. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it smiles when I don't. I threw away all the mirrors in my apartment except the one in the bathroom. I had to keep that one, but I try not to look at it too closely. Try not to think about what I might see looking back at me. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear voices. My voice and my mother's voice, having conversations I'm not part of. And in those conversations, my mother is always asking the same question. When are you coming back to visit me? And my voice, the voice that isn't quite mine, always gives the same answer. Soon, Mom. Very soon. I haven't been back to Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. I tell myself I'll never go back. But sometimes I find myself looking at maps, tracing the route to Iron Creek Campground with my finger. Sometimes I find myself packing a bag without meaning to, getting in my car without planning to. And sometimes when I catch sight of my reflection in a store window or the side of a building, I see that I'm smiling. A wide, bright smile that doesn't feel like my own. The ashes are scattered now, just like I promised. But I'm beginning to think that some promises shouldn't be kept. Some promises open doors that were meant to stay closed. My reflection knows this. She's been trying to tell me, in her own way. She's been trying to warn me, but I'm not sure I'm listening to the right voice anymore. Story 3. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 34, and the first mistake I made at Devil's Backbone Wilderness area in Texas was thinking sleep was optional. Every time we closed our eyes, we lost hours, and something followed closer. The plan had been simple enough. 3 days of RV camping in the hill country, just me and my boyfriend Marcus, trying to patch together what was left of our relationship after 18 months of him working oil rigs, and me teaching 3rd grade to increasingly hostile kids. The Devil's Backbone had seemed perfect on the website, remote enough for privacy, established enough for safety. The kind of place where you could have conversations that mattered without the neighbors hearing through apartment walls. Marcus had driven his dad's old Winnebago, a 1987 beast that smelled like cigarettes and pine sol despite our best efforts. I'd packed enough food for a week, partly because I was nervous about being that far from civilization, partly because I knew Marcus ate when he was stressed. The drive from Austin took 3 hours, winding through scrub oak and limestone hills that looked like God's own sculpture garden. "Look at that," Marcus said as we pulled into the campground. His voice carried that forced enthusiasm he used when he was trying to convince himself something was working. Not another soul around. He was right. The place was empty except for us, which should have been the first warning. October in Texas usually brought decent camping weather, but the ranger at check-in had looked at us with something that might have been pity. "Y'all sure you want to stay out there?" he'd asked, a weathered man named Kowalski whose name tag was held on with duct tape. "Storm's coming through tomorrow night. Could get rough." "We've got everything we need," Marcus had said, patting the Winnebago's side like it was a faithful horse. "This old girl's seen worse." The ranger had shrugged and handed us our permits. "Site 13's open. Follow the road about 2 miles, you'll see the marker. Cell service is spotty out there, but there's a radio in your packet if you need help." Site 13 sat in a clearing surrounded by live oaks and cedar, with a fire ring that looked like it hadn't been used in months. The silence was immediate and complete. No highway noise, no neighbors, just the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of a hawk. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like being watched. We set up camp in the late afternoon sun, Marcus leveling the RV while I arranged our gear. The routine was familiar and comforting. Fold-out chairs around the fire pit, cooler positioned for easy access, solar lanterns hung from the awning, normal things that made the emptiness feel less threatening. "Remember our first camping trip?" Marcus asked as he connected the propane. "You were convinced every sound was a bear." "That was Arkansas. They actually had bears." I tried to match his lightness, but something felt off. The air tasted metallic like the moment before lightning strikes. This is supposed to be safe. Safe enough. He tested the stove burner, the flame hissing blue against the growing dusk. Want to start dinner? I'll get the fire going. That's when we learned the first rule of Devil's Backbone. Fire doesn't want to catch. Marcus went through a full box of matches and 2 fire starter logs before admitting defeat. The wood was dry, the kindling perfect, but every flame guttered out like someone was blowing on it. Weird, he muttered, trying his lighter for the 10th time. Wind must be shifting. But there was no wind. The air hung still and heavy, pregnant with a storm that felt days away despite Kowalski's warning. We ate cold sandwiches and drank warm beer, while the darkness pressed against our little circle of LED light. Early night, Marcus suggested, around 9, though it felt much later. The darkness had weight here, substance. It didn't just hide things, it seemed to create them. Inside the RV, I felt better. Aluminum walls and familiar smells, the hum of the propane refrigerator. Marcus pulled out the bed while I brushed my teeth at the tiny sink. Both of us moving through the ritual of settling in for the night. "Love you," he said as I climbed under the covers, and for the first time in months, he sounded like he meant it. I woke up to daylight streaming through the windows and Marcus shaking my shoulder. Sarah, wake up." "What time is it?" My phone read 2:47 p.m. That can't be right. Marcus held up his watch, an old Timex his grandfather had given him, the kind that never lied. 2:45. We've been asleep for almost 18 hours. That wasn't possible. I was a light sleeper, had been since childhood. I woke up when Marcus shifted positions, when the refrigerator cycled on, when squirrels ran across the roof. 18 hours of uninterrupted sleep was like claiming I'd grown wings. "Must have been more tired than we thought," Marcus said, but his voice carried doubt. All that driving, the stress of getting away. We stumbled through an abbreviated morning routine, coffee and instant oatmeal while trying to shake off the disorientation. Everything felt slightly wrong, like waking up in a hotel room and forgetting where you were. The campsite looked the same, our gear exactly where we'd left it, but the quality of light was different. Sharper, more yellow than it should have been for October. "Want to hike the nature trail?" I suggested, needing to move, to prove the day was salvageable. "Work off some of this fog." The trail started 50 yards from our site, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, "Backbone Ridge Loop, 2.3 miles. Simple enough for an afternoon walk, especially if we were trying to make up for a lost morning. The path wound through stands of cedar and oak, limestone outcroppings creating natural sculptures along the way. Under normal circumstances, it would have been beautiful. The kind of place you took pictures to show friends back home. But something felt wrong with the proportions, like the trees were too tall or the shadows too short. My depth perception kept stuttering, making me stumble over roots that weren't where they appeared to be. "You okay?" Marcus asked when I caught myself against a tree for the 3rd time. "Just still waking up, I guess." We'd been walking for what felt like an hour when we reached the same trailhead sign. Backbone Ridge Loop, 2.3 miles, exactly as before. Did we turn around without realizing it? Marcus pulled out the trail map from his pocket, studied it with the focused attention he usually reserved for work schedules. "This doesn't make sense. We've been walking straight." I looked back down the trail. It curved away through the trees exactly as I remembered. No branches or side paths that could have confused us. Maybe we missed a turn. There was no turn. Just this one path. We tried again, this time paying careful attention to landmarks. A lightning-struck oak about a 1/4 mile in. A limestone formation that looked like a sleeping giant's face. A creek crossing where the water ran clear over white stones. All exactly as before, in exactly the same order, leading back to exactly the same sign. "This is impossible," Marcus said, and for the first time I heard real fear creep into his voice. Back at the campsite, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Fatigue, disorientation, the kind of confusion that comes from sleeping too long and waking up displaced. But the sun was already touching the horizon, and we'd only been awake for a few hours. "Let's just stay put tonight," I said, though the thought of another 18-hour sleep made my skin crawl. "Cook dinner, have a normal evening. Marcus nodded, but he kept glancing at the tree line like he expected something to emerge from the shadows. Fire first. I want light. This time the kindling caught immediately, flames leaping high and bright as if the wood had been soaked in gasoline. Marcus jerked his hand back, eyebrows singed. Jesus, what was that? Maybe the wood was drier than we thought? But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't right. Last night the same wood had refused to burn at all. Tonight it ignited like paper, flames dancing higher than seemed physically possible. We cooked over the propane stove instead, keeping our distance from the fire that burned too bright and cast shadows that moved independently of the flames. The silence pressed against us from all sides, broken only by the crack and hiss of burning wood. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice was tight. "Look at your watch." I checked my phone. 11:47 p.m. But the sun had been setting when we started cooking, and that couldn't have been more than half an hour ago. "The battery must be dying," I said, but my voice sounded unconvincing even to me. "Check your phone." Same time, 11:47 p.m., the numbers glowing accusingly in the darkness. I started to say impossible, but the word stuck in my throat. How many impossible things could happen before you stopped calling them impossible? We went to bed early, or what felt early despite what our devices claimed. Inside the RV, Marcus double-checked the locks on the door and windows. Not that they would stop anything determined, but the ritual was comforting. "Maybe we should leave in the morning," I said as we settled under the covers. "Maybe." But he didn't sound convinced. "Let's see how we feel after some sleep." I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to Marcus's breathing settle into the deep rhythm of sleep, listening to the silence outside that wasn't quite silence. There were sounds, soft, scratching against the aluminum walls, footsteps that might have been settling metal, a low humming that could have been wind through power lines except there were no power lines. When I woke up, the sun was setting. Marcus was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. Our phones read 6:23 p.m. We'd lost another day. "This isn't possible," he said without looking up. "People don't just lose time like this." But we had. Somehow we'd slept for nearly 20 hours again, and the worst part was that I felt rested. Better than rested, energized in a way that felt wrong, like my body was operating on borrowed time. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." Marcus nodded and started packing, but his movements were slow, dreamlike, like part of him was still asleep. I felt it too, a lethargy that seemed to seep up from the ground itself, making every action feel like swimming through honey. It took us 2 hours to break camp, tasks that should have taken 20 minutes stretching into endless, fumbling efforts. By the time we were ready to go, full darkness had fallen, and Marcus was too tired to drive safely. "Tomorrow," he said, slumping into his chair beside the fire that had, once again, lit itself. First thing in the morning. But I knew, with the certainty that comes from dreams you can't quite remember, that there would be no tomorrow, not the way we understood it. The third time we woke up, it was to the sound of something moving outside the RV. Heavy footsteps circled the vehicle, slow and deliberate, not quite human. The rhythm was wrong, like someone walking with too many joints in their legs. Marcus grabbed the baseball bat from the storage compartment and moved to the window, peering through the blinds. "Anything?" I whispered. "I can't. It's too dark." The footsteps stopped directly outside our door. In the silence that followed, I could hear breathing that wasn't ours. Deep, wet inhalations like someone with fluid in their lungs. Then, softly, a voice. "Sarah. Marcus. Time to wake up." It was my voice. Exactly my voice, down to the slight rasp I got when I was tired. But I hadn't spoken. "Sarah," the voice said again, patient and loving. "Marcus, time to wake up." Marcus looked at me, his face pale in the LED light. "That's not you." "Time to wake up," the voice repeated, and now there was something wrong with the cadence, like someone speaking English as a second language. "Time to wake up, time to wake up, time to wake up." The phrase became a chant, my voice layering over itself in impossible harmonies. More footsteps joined the first, circling the RV in a slow parade. Different gates, different rhythms, but all wrong in the same way. "Marcus," said Marcus's voice from outside. "Marcus, why won't you wake up?" "Sarah," said my voice. "Sarah, why won't you wake up?" More voices joined them. Our friends, our families, people from our past calling our names with increasing urgency. But underneath the familiar tones was something else. Something that had learned to imitate human speech but had never quite mastered it. "Don't listen," Marcus whispered, though I could see the effort it took. The voices were hypnotic, compelling. They promised comfort, rest, an end to the confusion of lost time. "Time to wake up," they chanted. "Time to wake up. Time to wake up." And that's when I understood. We had been waking up. Every time we thought we were going to sleep, we were actually waking up. And every time we thought we were waking up, we were falling deeper into something that wasn't quite sleep. The realization hit like cold water. The lost hours, the impossible geography of the hiking trail, the fire that wouldn't light and then burned too bright. We weren't experiencing time normally because we weren't in normal time. We were somewhere else, somewhere between sleeping and waking, and something was using our voices to call us deeper. "Marcus," I whispered, "we need to stay awake, really awake." "I don't understand. Every time we think we're sleeping, we're actually waking up. And every time we think we're waking up, we're falling asleep. That's why we're losing time. That's why nothing makes sense." The voices outside grew louder, more insistent. Our own words echoed back at us, conversations we'd had earlier twisted into pleas and demands. "Love you," said Marcus's voice from outside, but drawn out like taffy. "Love you." I pinched myself, bit my tongue, anything to maintain the sharp edge of consciousness. Marcus caught on and did the same, both of us fighting against the warm lethargy that wanted to pull us under. "How do we get out?" he asked. "I don't know, but we can't let ourselves sleep. Not really sleep." The voices continued through the night, or what passed for night in this place. Sometimes they whispered, sometimes they sang, sometimes they screamed our names with the desperation of the drowning. But gradually, as we held on to consciousness with bleeding fingernails, they began to fade. By dawn, if it was dawn, the silence had returned. We packed the RV with frantic efficiency, throwing gear into storage compartments without bothering to organize. Every second felt borrowed, stolen from something that would eventually demand payment. Marcus started the engine on the first try, and it caught with a roar that sounded like freedom. But as we drove toward the exit, the road seemed to stretch impossibly long. Mile markers repeated themselves. The same curve appeared again and again, and the speedometer insisted we were doing 60 while the scenery crawled past at walking speed. "It doesn't want us to leave," Marcus said, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "Keep driving. Don't stop for anything." It took 3 hours to travel the 2 miles to the main road, but finally we saw the ranger station ahead. Kowalski was in the same position as when we'd arrived, as if he'd never moved. "Leaving early?" he asked as Marcus handed over our permits. "We lost time," I said, needing him to understand. "We kept losing time, and there were voices." "Ah." Kowalski nodded like this was perfectly normal. "That happens sometimes. The backbone's got its own rhythm. Some folks adjust, some don't. How long were we there?" He checked his logbook. 3 days, checked in Monday, checking out Thursday. But I knew we'd only been conscious for maybe 8 hours total. The rest was gone, swallowed by whatever lived in the spaces between sleeping and waking. We drove back to Austin in absolute silence, neither of us trusting our voices after hearing them used against us. It wasn't until we reached the city limits that I felt like I could breathe normally again. That was 6 months ago. Marcus and I broke up 2 weeks later, not because of what happened at Devil's Backbone, but because of what it revealed about us, how easily we could be lost, how fragile our grip on reality really was. I still sleep poorly. Every time I close my eyes, I'm afraid I'll wake up somewhere else. Someone else. I've started setting multiple alarms, asking friends to call and check on me, anything to maintain a connection to linear time. Sometimes, late at night, I hear my own voice calling from outside my apartment window. Sarah, time to wake up. But I never look and I never answer, because I know now that some kinds of sleep are permanent. The Devil's Backbone is still open for camping. I checked the website last week. Site 13 is always available, they say. Perfect for those looking to get away from it all. I wonder how many people are still there, lost in the spaces between heartbeats, calling each other's names in voices that sound almost right. I wonder if they know they're not really awake, or if they've forgotten the difference entirely. I wonder if someday I'll stop wondering and just go back. The voices promise rest, after all. Real rest. The kind where you never have to wake up again. Story 4. My name is Marcus. I'm 34, and at the Shasta Trinity National Forest, the stars arranged themselves into a warning I couldn't read. I should have paid attention to that first night, should have understood that some patterns in the sky aren't meant for human eyes. But I was too busy trying to prove something to myself, too focused on running from the wreckage of my marriage to notice that I'd driven straight into something worse. The divorce papers were still warm in my glove compartment when I pulled the rented RV into the dispersed camping area off Forest Road 17, about 15 miles northeast of Weaverville. Sarah had taken the house, the dog, and most of my faith in myself. All I had left was 2 weeks of vacation time and a desperate need to remember who I was before I became half of something that fell apart. The campsite felt isolated enough. A clearing bordered by towering Douglas firs and sugar pines, with a creek babbling somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line. Perfect for a man who wanted to disappear for a while. I'd picked this spot specifically because it was remote, because cell service was non-existent, because the nearest neighbor was miles away. In retrospect, those selling points should have been red flags. I wasn't alone, though. 3 other campers had beaten me to the general area. Jake and Melissa, a couple in their late 20s from Portland who'd set up their vintage Airstream about a quarter-mile south, and David Chen, a quiet guy in his 40s traveling solo in a converted van, positioned roughly the same distance to the north. We'd exchanged brief pleasantries when I arrived, the kind of polite distance that serious campers maintain. Everyone respecting everyone else's desire for solitude. The first night passed without incident. I grilled a lonely steak, drank 2 beers while watching the fire, and fell asleep to the sound of the creek and the soft whisper of wind through the pines. Normal, peaceful, the kind of evening that should have started healing whatever was broken inside me. I woke up around 3 a.m. to absolute silence. The creek had stopped running. The wind had died. Even the usual symphony of insects and night birds had simply ceased. I lay there in the RV's narrow bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to understand why my skin felt like it was crawling. Outside, nothing moved, nothing breathed. The forest held itself like a photograph. Then I heard it. A sound like metal scraping against stone, coming from somewhere near David's camp. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic, like someone dragging a shovel across granite. I waited for it to stop, but it continued for nearly 10 minutes before fading into the unnatural quiet. Morning brought back the normal sounds of the forest, and I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, alcohol, sleeping in an unfamiliar place, any number of explanations made more sense than something actually being wrong. I made coffee, ate instant oatmeal, and decided to hike the area to familiarize myself with the terrain. That's when I found the hatch. It was about a mile from my campsite, hidden in a depression between 2 massive boulders that had probably been there since the last ice age. The hatch itself was maybe 4 feet square, made of thick steel painted forest green, with a handle that looked like it belonged on a submarine. Moss and decades of fallen leaves had nearly camouflaged it, but recent disturbance around the edges suggested someone had been here recently. Someone had been digging. Fresh earth was piled around the hatch's perimeter, and the metal showed scratches where tools had chipped away rust and debris. The lock that had once secured it lay nearby, cut cleanly through with bolt cutters. Someone had opened this thing, and recently. I should have walked away. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to head back to camp, pack up the RV, and find somewhere else to spend my vacation. But divorce does strange things to a man's judgment. Makes him feel like he needs to prove his courage, especially to himself. Makes him open doors that should stay closed. The hatch lifted easily on well-oiled hinges, revealing a ladder that disappeared into perfect darkness. The smell that rose from below was wrong. Not quite decay, not quite chemicals, but something that made my reptile brain want to run. Cold air flowed upward, carrying that odor and something else. The sound of breathing that wasn't quite human. I closed the hatch quickly and weighed it down with the largest rock I could move. Whatever was down there could stay down there. I'd satisfied my curiosity and lived to regret it. Walking back to camp, I noticed things I'd missed on the way out. Scratches in the bark of trees at roughly eye level, too deep and too regular to be from animals. Patches of ground where nothing grew, as if the soil itself had been poisoned. And tracks, not quite human, not quite animal, pressed into the soft earth near the creek. David was sitting by his van when I returned, staring off into the trees with an expression I couldn't read. He looked like he hadn't slept, and when I called out a greeting, he took several seconds to focus on me. "You hear anything strange last night?" I asked. He studied my face for a long moment before answering. "Depends what you mean by strange. Metal scraping. Around 3 in the morning. Something shifted behind his eyes. Yeah, I heard that. Any idea what it was?" David stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his jeans with hands that shook slightly. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should probably leave. All of us." "Why?" He pointed toward the trees where I'd found the hatch. "Because I've been camping these woods for 15 years. And that sound, I heard it once before, summer of 2018. My hiking partner went to investigate." He met my eyes. "They never found his body." Before I could respond, Jake appeared through the trees, jogging toward us with the kind of urgency that suggested panic barely held in check. He was pale, sweating despite the cool morning air, and his eyes kept darting back the way he'd come. "You guys need to see this," he said, breathing hard. "Both of you. Right now." We followed him back toward his campsite, but stopped short when we saw what had spooked him. Melissa was standing perfectly still about 50 yards from their airstream, facing away from us toward the tree line. She'd been standing there for at least 10 minutes, according to Jake, and hadn't moved or responded to his calls. "Mel!" Jake shouted. "Melissa!" She didn't turn around, didn't even twitch. From this distance, she could have been a statue. We approached slowly, calling her name, but she remained motionless. When we got close enough to see her face in profile, my blood went cold. Her eyes were wide open but completely white. No iris, no pupil, just the blank stare of a marble statue. And she was smiling. Not a human smile. Too wide. Too many teeth. "Jesus Christ," David whispered. Jake reached out to touch her shoulder, and that's when she moved. Fast. Faster than should have been possible. She spun around to face us, that terrible smile never wavering, and opened her mouth to speak. What came out wasn't her voice. It was deeper, rougher, like gravel being ground together, and it spoke in a language none of us recognized. Harsh syllables that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight to the part of the brain that processes fear. Jake staggered backward, and Melissa's head tilted to follow his movement with the mechanical precision of a security camera. Her smile widened further, stretching her face in ways that faces shouldn't stretch. Then, as suddenly as it had started, whatever was wrong with her stopped. Her eyes rolled back to normal, the smile faded, and she collapsed to her knees, gasping. "What happened?" she asked, looking up at us with genuine confusion. "Why are you all staring at me like that?" None of us answered. What could we say? That she'd been standing motionless for 15 minutes, speaking in tongues with eyes like billiard balls? That she'd smiled like something wearing her face as a mask? Jake helped her to her feet, and she seemed fine. Tired, maybe, but definitely herself again. She had no memory of the episode, insisted she'd just stepped outside to enjoy the morning air and must have zoned out for a moment. "We should break camp," David said quietly when Melissa was back in the airstream. "All of us. Today." "Why?" Jake asked. David and I exchanged glances. "How do you explain that you found what looks like an entrance to hell? and your girlfriend just spent quarter of an hour channeling something that definitely wasn't human. Trust me, I said. We should go. But Jake wasn't having it. We just got here. Mel's been looking forward to this trip for months. She's probably just stressed from work, had some kind of episode. It happens. I wanted to argue, but what evidence did I have? A hatch in the woods that could have been some old military installation, strange sounds that could have been settling metal, or animals. A woman having what might have been a seizure of some kind. When you say it like that, it sounds almost reasonable. David tried again. Something's wrong with this place. I can feel it. You're being paranoid, Jake said, but I could see doubt creeping into his expression. We agreed to compromise. One more night. If anything else strange happened, we'd all leave in the morning. I wasn't happy about it, but I was outnumbered, and part of me, the part that was still trying to prove I wasn't a coward, thought maybe I was overreacting. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself by exploring the area around my campsite. The creek was running normally again, and the forest seemed to have returned to its natural rhythms. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, insects buzzed. The oppressive atmosphere of the morning had lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. I found myself relaxing despite everything. Maybe David was right to be cautious, but maybe Jake was right too. Maybe we were just a group of stressed-out people jumping at shadows in an unfamiliar place. Then I found the second hatch. This one was about half a mile from the first, equally well hidden but recently disturbed. The lock had been cut, the earth around it freshly turned. When I lifted it, the same wrong smell rose from the darkness below, and I heard something moving down there, something large enough to make the ladder rungs creak. I slammed it shut and ran. Back at camp, I tried calling David and Jake on the radio channels we'd agreed to monitor, but got only static. Cell phones showed no signal, as expected. I was on my own with the knowledge that whatever was down in those holes was mobile, and there were at least 2 ways for it to reach the surface. The sun was setting when I heard the third sound of metal scraping stone. This time it was closer, coming from the direction of Jake and Melissa's camp. I grabbed a flashlight and started toward the sound, then stopped. What if it wasn't Melissa standing motionless this time? What if it was Jake? What if whatever had spoken through her was getting stronger, able to maintain control for longer periods? What if it had both of them? I tried the radio again. Nothing but static punctuated by what might have been whispers in that same unknown language Melissa had spoken. The whispers seemed to come from multiple voices, overlapping and echoing in ways that hurt to listen to. Full darkness fell like a curtain, and that's when the real nightmare began. The sounds started around 9 o'clock, multiple sources of that metallic scraping coming from all directions. North, south, east, west. As if something was emerging from hatches I hadn't found yet, or maybe from new ones being opened from below. My RV suddenly felt like a metal coffin. Too visible, too confining. If something wanted to get in, the thin aluminum walls wouldn't stop it. If I needed to run, the narrow door would create a fatal bottleneck. I killed all the lights and sat in the dark, listening. The scraping sounds grew closer, accompanied now by footsteps that didn't quite match human cadence, too heavy, too deliberate, with pauses in the wrong places. And underneath it all, that whispered language, growing louder and more insistent. Around midnight, someone knocked on my door. "Marcus!" It was Melissa's voice, sweet and concerned. "Are you okay? We saw your lights go out." I didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because I could see through the window, and there was nobody standing outside my door. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Marcus, please. Something's wrong with Jake. I need help." The voice was perfect. Exactly Melissa's tone, her cadence, her slight Oregon accent. But there was no one there. "I know you're in there," the voice continued. "I can hear you breathing." That's when I realized I was holding my breath, had been for the past minute. Whatever was speaking had ears sharp enough to detect the sound of my lungs working from outside a closed RV. "Please," the voice said, and now it sounded like it was crying. "He's hurt. He's bleeding. I think something bit him." I wanted to believe it was really her. Wanted to open the door and help. But the empty space outside the window told a different story. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by silence that stretched for long minutes. Then, very quietly, I heard something trying the door handle, testing it, learning its resistance. The handle turned slowly, but I'd locked the deadbolt. Metal clicked against metal as whatever was out there explored the mechanism, trying to understand how it worked. "Marcus," the voice said again, but it wasn't Melissa anymore. It was Jake now, urgent and afraid. "Something's got Mel. Dragged her into the woods. I need your help to track it." Still no one visible outside. The voice changed again, becoming David this time. "There are more hatches. Dozens of them. They're all opening." Then it was my ex-wife Sarah, using the exact tone she'd used during our last fight. "You always were a coward, Marcus. Too scared to fight for our marriage, too scared to help your friends." That almost worked. Almost got me to unlock the door out of sheer angry reflex. But Sarah was 300 miles away, and whatever was using her voice was standing right outside. The assault on the door handle stopped. Footsteps moved away from the RV, circling it slowly. I tracked the sound through the thin walls, turning in place to keep facing the source. Around the front, along the passenger side, past the back, up the driver's side. The footsteps stopped directly outside the driver's side window. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something looking in. The sensation of being watched pressed against my skin like a physical weight. My breath fogged the glass despite the warm night air, and in that condensation, letters began to appear. COMEOUT. Written from outside, backward from my perspective, as if invisible fingers were tracing the words in the moisture. I grabbed my cell phone and turned on the flashlight app, flooding the window with harsh LED light. For just a moment, something was illuminated outside. A face that might have been human once, but stretched and wrong, with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator's. Then it was gone, leaving only the fading letters on the glass. The RV began to rock, gently at first, as if something large was leaning against it, then more violently, side to side, as if multiple something were coordinating their efforts to tip it over. Dishes rattled in the cabinets. The keys hanging from my ignition chimed against each other in frantic rhythm. I lunged for the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine caught immediately, and I threw it into drive without bothering to retract the stabilizing jacks. They bent and snapped as the RV lurched forward, but I didn't care. I just needed to move, to get away from whatever was trying to turn my shelter into a trap. The headlights swept across the campsite as I spun the wheel, and in that brief illumination, I saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly motionless. Jake, Melissa, and David, all facing the RV with identical expressions of patient hunger. Except they weren't Jake, Melissa, and David. Not anymore. Their proportions were wrong. Arms too long, necks stretched like they'd been pulled taffy. Their faces held those same too wide smiles Melissa had worn during her episode. But now the smiles were permanent, carved into their features like scars, and their eyes reflected the headlights like mirrors. I floored the accelerator and aimed for the dirt road that had brought me here. The RV wasn't built for speed, but fear gave it motivation. Trees flashed past the windows as I careened down the narrow track, scraping against branches and bouncing over rocks that should have shattered the axles. In the rear-view mirror, I could see lights moving through the forest. Not flashlights, something dimmer and more diffuse, like phosphorescent rot. And they were following, keeping pace despite the RV's desperate speed. The road seemed longer than it had during my arrival, winding through darkness that felt thick as tar. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the night, but everything beyond their reach writhed with movement that might have been shadows or might have been worse. Something hit the roof. The impact shook the entire vehicle and left scratches in the fiberglass, long, parallel gouges like claws. Then another impact, and another. Whatever was up there was trying to tear its way in. I swerved hard to the right, hoping to throw it off, but the clawing sounds continued. Through the skylight above the bed, I caught glimpses of a pale hand, or something like a hand, working at the plastic cover. The main road appeared ahead, marked by a reflective sign that seemed impossibly bright after the oppressive darkness of the forest. I took the turn too fast, feeling the RV's outside wheels leave the ground for a terrifying moment before slamming back down. The scratching on the roof stopped. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears and the labored whine of the engine. The headlights showed empty asphalt stretching ahead, normal and familiar and beautiful in its mundane reality. I drove for another hour before I felt safe enough to stop at a gas station. Under the fluorescent lights, I inspected the damage to the RV. The roof was scratched deeply enough to expose metal in some places, and the stabilizing jacks were twisted into abstract sculptures. But I was alive, and I was away from whatever lived in those woods. The kid working the night shift asked what had happened to the roof. I told him I'd taken a wrong turn and gotten into an argument with some low-hanging branches. He seemed satisfied with that explanation. I filled the tank, bought coffee and aspirin, and called the RV rental company to report the damage. They weren't happy, but they were more interested in getting their vehicle back than in assigning blame. I told them I'd had an accident and needed to end the rental early. What I didn't tell them was that I'd lost 3 people in those woods. That Jake, Melissa, and David were still out there, changed into something that wore their faces but fed on whatever crawled up from underground. What I didn't tell anyone was about the dreams that started the night I got home. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. But now I know what the hatches are for. They're not keeping something buried. They're marking places where the boundary between our world and somewhere else has worn thin. Places where hungry things can push through when the conditions are right. In the dreams, I can see more hatches opening. Not just in Northern California, but everywhere. National forests, state parks, wilderness areas across the country. A network of doorways spreading like an infection, each one allowing more of them to slip through. And in the dreams, I can hear Melissa's voice calling my name. Not the thing that took her shape, but her real voice, echoing up from the dark spaces below ground. She's still alive down there, along with Jake and David and who knows how many others. Still themselves, but trapped in a place where the shadows have teeth and the darkness breathes. Sometimes I think about going back, about gathering evidence, convincing someone in authority to investigate. But who would believe a story about underground hatches and people who come back wrong? And what if I'm exactly what they're waiting for? Someone who knows where to find them. Someone who could lead others into their trap. So I stay home. I avoid forests. I sleep with every light in the house burning, and I try not to think about how many other camping areas have dispersed sites in remote locations. How many other vacationers might be looking for solitude in all the wrong places. But, mostly, I think about the stars that night in Shasta Trinity, how they'd arranged themselves into a pattern that had felt like a warning, a message written in celestial fire, telling me to leave before it was too late. I should have listened, should have packed up and driven away the moment I felt that wrongness in the air. Instead, I let pride and stubbornness keep me there until people died, and things that shouldn't exist crawled up from the spaces between spaces. Now, when I look up at the night sky, I can't help but search for patterns, for configurations of stars that might be trying to tell me something important. Because somewhere out there, in forests and parks and wilderness areas I'll never visit again, more hatches are waiting to be found, and the things below are patient. They've been waiting in the dark for longer than human memory, and they can wait longer still, but they're learning. Each person who disappears teaches them something new about us. Each face they steal gives them better camouflage. They're coming up, not all at once, but gradually, carefully, and by the time most people realize what's happening, it'll be too late to close the doors we never should have opened. I keep telling myself that I escaped, that I got away clean and left that nightmare behind in the woods where it belongs. But sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when sleep finally takes me, I dream that I'm still there, still in that RV, still surrounded by darkness and the sound of something trying to get in. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wake up with dirt under my fingernails and the taste of earth in my mouth. The stars were trying to warn me, but I couldn't read their language. Now, I'm learning to speak it myself, one nightmare at a time. And the message is always the same. They're coming up. They're coming up. They're coming up. The hatch at Shasta Trinity was just the beginning. Story 5. My name is Marcus, I'm 34, and I drove my Winnebago to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State, thinking solitude would help me process my divorce. The air tasted like a penny the moment I understood I wasn't alone. What I found among those Douglas firs wasn't healing. It was something ancient and hungry that had been waiting for someone desperate enough to venture this deep off the main camping routes. I'd pulled off Forest Road 25 onto an unmarked dirt track that my GPS swore didn't exist. The Winnebago's suspension groaned over ruts and fallen branches, but I kept driving until the trees closed in like a tunnel. When I finally stopped, the silence pressed against my eardrums like water. The clearing was perfect. Too perfect. A natural circle of flat ground surrounded by towering evergreens, their tops lost in late afternoon mist. I set up my folding chair and cracked open a beer, trying to convince myself this was exactly what I needed. No cell service, no lawyers calling about asset division, no reminders of Sarah's empty closet or the divorce papers signed 3 days ago. But as dusk settled, I noticed things that made my skin crawl. The first was the smell. Underneath the pine and damp earth was something else. A sweet, cloying odor like meat left too long in the sun. I walked the perimeter of my campsite, following my nose, and found the source about 50 yards into the tree line. Animal bones, hundreds of them, arranged in perfect concentric circles around a massive old-growth cedar. Not scattered by scavengers or weather, placed, deliberately. The outer ring held large bones I recognized as deer femurs and ribs. The inner circles got smaller, rabbits, squirrels, what looked like dozens of birds. At the very center, arranged like the spokes of a wheel, were skulls of all sizes. Their empty sockets pointed inward toward the tree's trunk. I should have left then. Should have packed up the Winnebago and driven straight back to civilization. Instead, I stood there as shadows lengthened, studying the precision of the arrangement. Someone had spent considerable time on this. The bones were clean, weathered white, some clearly older than others. This wasn't a recent ritual, it was ongoing. A stick cracked behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but saw only forest. The trees seemed closer than they'd been moments before, their trunks forming barriers that blocked my view back to the clearing. I could no longer see my RV's white bulk through the green maze. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin in the stillness. "Anyone there?" Nothing. Even the insects had gone quiet. I made my way back to camp, pushing through underbrush that caught at my clothes like grasping fingers. When I finally emerged into the clearing, relief flooded through me at the sight of my Winnebago's familiar bulk. But something was wrong. My folding chair had been moved. Not knocked over by wind. Repositioned. It now faced the forest instead of the clearing's center, as if someone had been sitting in it, watching the trees. My beer bottle was gone. I checked the RV's door, still locked. Windows secure. No signs of forced entry. But when I climbed inside, the smell hit me. That same sweet, rotten odor from the bone circles. It was faint, but unmistakable, as if something had breathed it into the recycled air. I grabbed my emergency spotlight and swept the clearing. Nothing moved in the white beam except swaying branches. The forest edge remained black and impenetrable, but I had the crawling sensation of being observed. Multiple sets of eyes, patient and hungry. Sleep was impossible. I lay in the RV's narrow bed, listening to the night sounds. Owl calls that lasted too long, rustling that moved in purposeful patterns rather than random wildlife activity. Twice I heard what sounded like footsteps circling the Winnebago, but when I peered through the window blinds, I saw nothing. Around 3 a.m., something scratched at the door, not the random scraping of a curious animal. 3 slow, deliberate scratches. Pause. 3 more. I grabbed the spotlight and yanked open the door, flooding the area with light. A deer stood 10 feet away, but it was wrong. Its neck twisted at an impossible angle, head hanging upside down so its dead eyes stared directly at me. Its mouth hung open, revealing a human tongue that lolled past broken teeth. The rest of its body remained perfectly upright, as if it had been carefully posed. I slammed the door and engaged every lock. Outside, I heard a wet sliding sound, like something being dragged away. When I looked again minutes later, the deer was gone, but dark stains marked the ground where it had stood. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Dawn brought fog so thick I could barely see 20 feet in any direction. The normal sounds of a forest waking up, birdsong, small animals moving through underbrush, were completely absent. The silence felt heavy, expectant. I made coffee with shaking hands and tried to convince myself to pack up and leave. But I couldn't. Not yet. Whatever was happening here, I needed to understand it. The divorce had left me feeling powerless, like a spectator in my own life. This, whatever this was, demanded action. Demanded that I stop running and face something real, even if it terrified me. I armed myself with a heavy-duty flashlight and hiking knife, then ventured back to the bone circles. In daylight, they looked different, more elaborate. I counted 7 distinct rings, each perfectly spaced. The bones showed no signs of animal gnawing or weather damage. They looked almost preserved. The massive cedar at the center drew my attention. Its trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, scarred with deep gouges that formed recognizable patterns. Not random scratches from bear claws, deliberate symbols carved into the living wood. Spirals within spirals, interconnected in ways that hurt to look at directly. Movement caught my eye. Something pale flickered between the trees beyond the bone circles. I followed, pushing deeper into the forest than I'd intended. The fog seemed to guide me, clearing just enough to reveal a path while closing behind to prevent retreat. I found the source of the bones. A natural depression in the forest floor held what remained of dozens of animals, but they hadn't died naturally. Each carcass was positioned identically, lying on their sides with legs extended, heads turned to face the same direction. The flesh had been stripped away with surgical precision, leaving clean skeletons ready for harvest. But not all the bones had been taken. Some still held fragments of hide and sinew, recent kills, maybe days old. The smell was overwhelming here, sweet rot mixed with something medicinal, like formaldehyde. I covered my nose and mouth with my shirt, fighting the urge to vomit. That's when I saw them. Human bones. 3 skulls, yellow with age, placed at the depression's edge like sentinels. Below them, rib cages and femurs arranged with the same obsessive precision as the animal remains. I knelt beside one skull, noting the perfect circular hole drilled through the temple. Clean edges, made with tools rather than trauma. Someone lived here. Had been living here for years, maybe decades. Killing methodically, preserving, arranging. Creating something that went beyond simple insanity into realm of ritualistic purpose. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, knife raised, and saw him. The man stood maybe 30 feet away, partially obscured by fog and underbrush. He was tall, gaunt to the point of starvation, wearing clothes that might have once been park ranger uniforms but now hung in tatters. His skin had the waxy pallor of someone who rarely saw sunlight, but it was his eyes that made my blood freeze. Completely white, like cataracts, yet they tracked my movement with predatory focus. He smiled, revealing teeth filed to points. "New bones," he said in a voice like grinding glass. "Fresh meat for the circles." I ran. Crashing through underbrush, branches whipping my face, I sprinted toward where I thought my campsite lay. But the fog had thickened, and every direction looked the same. Tree trunks emerged from white mist like prison bars. I stumbled over roots and fallen logs, the sound of my own breathing harsh in the unnatural silence. Behind me, something followed. Not running, walking. A steady, patient pace that suggested my pursuer knew these woods intimately, knew I was lost. I burst into a clearing and nearly sobbed with relief. My Winnebago sat exactly where I'd left it, solid and real in the swirling mist. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door. Inside, I grabbed my cell phone. No signal, as expected, but I turned on the GPS anyway. The screen showed my location as a blue dot in a vast green void. No roads, no landmarks. According to the satellite data, I was in the middle of uncharted wilderness. That was impossible. I'd driven here on marked forest roads. There had been signs, mile markers. But now my GPS insisted I was 50 miles from the nearest maintained trail. A soft knock at the door made me freeze. 3 careful taps, like a polite visitor. "I know you're in there." The voice was different now. Younger, friendlier, almost normal. "I'm sorry if I startled you. I live out here, been watching over these woods for a long time. You're not in any danger." I peered through the window blind. The gaunt man stood beside my RV, but his appearance had changed. He looked healthier, cleaner. The ranger uniform seemed newer. His eyes were a normal brown color, crinkling with what appeared to be genuine concern. "My name's Dale," he continued. "I know this is strange, finding someone way out here, but I maintain the wildlife preserve. Keep track of animal populations, that sort of thing. The bone arrangements you found. That's part of a research project. We're studying decomposition rates in different environmental conditions." It sounded reasonable, official, but I remembered those filed teeth, those dead white eyes. I kept silent. "Look, I can see you're spooked," Dale said. "Tell you what, why don't you follow me back to my station? It's not far. I've got a radio, can call for an escort back to the main road. Sometimes the fog makes these old logging trails hard to navigate." Part of me wanted to believe him. The rational part that insisted there had to be a logical explanation for everything I'd seen. But my gut screamed warnings. The man outside might look normal now, but I'd seen what lay beneath that facade. "Just give me a minute," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Need to pack up some things." "Of course, take your time." I moved to the RV's back window and slowly raised the blind. Dale stood exactly where he'd been, still smiling that friendly smile. But behind him, barely visible in the fog, I could see shapes moving among the trees. Human silhouettes that swayed and jerked like marionettes with tangled strings. When Dale turned his head to look in their direction, his neck rotated a full 180 degrees. The sound was like breaking kindling. I bit back a scream and dropped the blind. When I looked again, Dale faced forward normally, but his smile had changed. The friendly mask was slipping, revealing something underneath that had never been human. "Everything all right in there?" he asked. "You've been awfully quiet." I grabbed my backpack and stuffed it with essentials. Water bottles, emergency food, first aid kit, knife. If I could get to the forest on the opposite side of the clearing, maybe I could circle around, find my way back to the road. The RV was too slow, too clumsy for these narrow trails. On foot, I might have a chance. The back window was just large enough to squeeze through. I unlocked it quietly, grateful for the well-maintained hinges that opened without sound. Dale's voice continued from the front of the RV, patient but with an edge creeping in. "I really think we should get you out of here before dark. These woods aren't safe after sundown. Things come out that don't like visitors." I dropped my backpack through the window first, then squeezed through myself. The fog provided perfect cover. I couldn't see more than 10 feet, which meant Dale couldn't see me either. I grabbed the pack and low-crawled toward the tree line, moving as quietly as possible. "Marcus?" Dale's voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. "Don't make this difficult. The bones need to be arranged properly. The circles demand completion." He knew my name. I hadn't told him my name. I reached the forest edge and risked a look back. Dale stood motionless beside the RV, head tilted at that impossible angle again. Behind him, more figures emerged from the fog. Men and women in various states of decay, some missing limbs, others with bones protruding through rotted skin. All of them stared in my direction with those same dead white eyes. I plunged into the trees. Navigation was hopeless in the thick fog, but I kept moving, hoping to put distance between myself and whatever Dale was becoming. The forest felt different here, older, wilder. These weren't the managed woodlands near camping areas, but something primeval. Trees grew so thick their canopy blocked what little light filtered through the mist. I stumbled over something and looked down to find another bone circle, smaller than the one near the cedar, but arranged with the same obsessive precision. At its center lay a human skeleton, arms crossed over its chest like a medieval tomb carving. The skull watched me with empty sockets. More circles appeared as I walked, dozens of them, scattered throughout the forest like some vast, incomprehensible map. Each contained human remains positioned identically. Each skull faced the same direction, toward something deeper in the woods. I followed their gaze. The fog began to thin as I climbed a gentle slope, revealing glimpses of what lay ahead. At first I thought it was a massive tree, larger than anything that should exist in these mountains. But as I drew closer, I realized my mistake. It was a tower, built from human bones cemented together with some dark, organic material. Hundreds of skulls formed decorative rings around the structure's circumference. Arm and leg bones created intricate support lattices. The entire thing rose at least 50 feet into the canopy, disappearing into the mist above. At its base was an opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. Pale light flickered from within, and I could hear sounds. Wet, rhythmic noises like someone working with raw meat. I should have run, should have used what daylight remained to find my way back to civilization. Instead, I crept closer, drawn by a morbid need to understand what I'd stumbled into. The opening led to a chamber hollowed out from the tower's interior. The walls were lined with human skulls, each one drilled with that same precise hole I'd noticed earlier. Candles made from what looked like rendered human fat provided wavering illumination. The smell was indescribable. Death and decay mixed with something cloyingly sweet. In the chamber's center, a figure hunched over a wooden table. Not Dale. Even this was something else entirely. Female, or what had once been female, her skin hanging in loose folds like an ill-fitting garment. Her hair was long and gray, streaming down her back in tangled ropes. She worked with surgical precision, using bone knives to strip flesh from what might have been a human torso. She looked up as I approached, revealing a face that belonged in nightmares. Her eyes were gone, replaced by the same white orbs I'd seen in Dale and the others. Her mouth was a ruin of broken teeth and black gums. But she smiled when she saw me, an expression of maternal warmth that made my stomach turn. "Welcome, child," she said in a voice like grinding bones. "You've come home at last." That's when I understood. This wasn't random. The bone circles, the fog, the GPS malfunction, all of it designed to guide me here. I hadn't stumbled into this nightmare by accident. I'd been chosen. "The circles told us you were coming," the woman continued, her hands never pausing in their grisly work. "A man wounded by betrayal, seeking solitude to heal. Perfect for our purposes." She gestured to the walls around us. "Each skull here represents someone like you, travelers who wandered too far from safety, who needed something more than ordinary comfort. We gave them purpose, made them part of something eternal." I backed toward the opening, but Dale's voice spoke from behind me. "Don't be afraid, Marcus. The transition isn't painful. In fact, most find it quite peaceful." He filled the chamber entrance, blocking my escape. Up close, his true nature was impossible to hide. His skin was gray and mottled, clinging to bones and patches. The friendly ranger facade had been completely abandoned. "You've seen the bone circles," he continued. "Each one marks a spot where someone joined our community. Their physical forms became part of the greater pattern, but their essence remains. They guide new arrivals, just as they guided you." The woman set down her bone knife and approached me. "You're special, Marcus. Your pain has prepared you for transformation. The betrayal you suffered, the loneliness, it's made you ready to become something more." I drew my hiking knife, but it felt pathetic against whatever these things were. Stay back. I'm warning you." They laughed, a sound like wind through cemetery gates. "Oh, child," the woman said, "you think you can hurt us? We've been dead for longer than your great-grandparents were alive. What's one more small blade against the accumulated weight of centuries?" Dale began to change. His already gaunt frame stretched taller, arms lengthening until his fingertips nearly touched the floor. His mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth like broken glass. The transformation was fluid, organic, as if his human form had been nothing more than an uncomfortable costume. "The beautiful thing about this place," he said, his voice now a wet whisper, "is that time works differently. You'll have eternity to understand what you've become, to appreciate the artistry of what we've built here." I feinted left, then dove right, trying to slip past Dale to the chamber entrance. For a moment, I thought I'd made it. Then something wrapped around my ankle. The woman's arm, extended like rubber to impossible length. She yanked me backward and I crashed to the bone-littered floor. They were on me in seconds, their touch like ice water on naked skin. Dale's transformed hands pressed against my temples while the woman held my struggling body still. I felt something cold and sharp penetrating my skull. Not physical pain, but something deeper, a drilling sensation that reached into my thoughts. "Don't fight it," the woman whispered. "The circles need completion. The pattern must be maintained." Darkness crept in from the edges of my vision. My struggles grew weaker as something vital drained away, flowing from my body into the bone structure around us. I could feel my life force being harvested, processed, prepared for whatever ritual kept this place functioning. But as consciousness faded, I heard something that didn't belong. The distant sound of an engine. Vehicle tires crunching over fallen branches. Someone was coming. Dale's head snapped up, his predatory focus broken. Impossible. The circles should have turned them away. The woman released her grip on me, moving to peer through cracks in the bone wall. "Rangers," she hissed. "A search party. Someone reported the missing camper. They'd been so focused on me that they hadn't sensed the approaching rescue. Whatever power guided lost travelers to this place had failed to detect people actively searching for someone specific." Dale snarled in frustration. "We'll have to finish this quickly. The ritual can be completed even if it's rushed." But the woman shook her head. "No. The pattern demands precision. A botched transformation would poison the entire structure." She looked at me with something resembling regret. "We'll have to let this one go." "Let him go?" Dale's voice rose to a shriek. "Do you know how long we've waited for someone suitable? How perfectly his emotional state matched our requirements?" "It can't be helped." The woman began moving toward a passage I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind hanging curtains of human hair. "The Rangers are too close. If we're discovered, everything we've built will be destroyed." Dale started to argue, but the sound of voices calling my name echoed through the forest, close enough to make out individual words. A search team with GPS and radio communication, people who couldn't be confused or misdirected like a lone traveler. The bone tower began to shudder. Whatever force held it together was withdrawing, preparing for concealment or escape. Skulls tumbled from the walls as the structure shifted and settled. "Find the deep places," the woman told Dale as she disappeared into the hidden passage. "Wait for the searchers to leave. When the time is right, we'll rebuild." Dale gave me one last look of pure hatred before following her into the darkness. The bone tower continued its collapse, walls folding inward as if the entire structure was nothing more than an elaborate illusion. I crawled toward the chamber entrance as bones rained down around me. My head felt like it had been split open, thoughts scattered and incomplete. Whatever they'd done during those few moments of contact had left permanent damage. I could feel it. Empty spaces where memories should be. Concepts that no longer made sense. The entrance collapsed just as I squeezed through it. Behind me, the tower folded completely into the earth, leaving nothing but a depression filled with ordinary forest debris. By the time the first flashlight beam found me, I was alone in a small clearing that showed no signs of supernatural activity. "Marcus, thank God we found you." Ranger Johnson knelt beside me checking for injuries while his partner called for a medical evacuation. They'd been searching since my ex-wife reported me missing. Apparently, I'd been gone for 5 days, though it felt like less than 24 hours. They found my Winnebago 3 miles away, parked beside Forest Road 25, exactly where the GPS said it should be. No sign of damage or disturbance. The bone circles, the tower, the clearing where I'd first made camp, all gone, as if they'd never existed. The official report blamed my disorientation on dehydration and stress-induced hallucinations. Divorce trauma, they said. Anxiety manifesting as elaborate fantasies. I was hospitalized for observation, treated for mild hypothermia and malnutrition, then released with a referral to a psychiatrist. But I know what I experienced. The holes in my memory prove it. Gaps where specific thoughts and recollections should exist, as if someone had carefully excised particular concepts. I can't remember my mother's face anymore, or the sound of my ex-wife's laugh. Simple words sometimes refuse to form in my mouth, their meanings erased by whatever process Dale and the woman had begun. 3 months later, I still wake up tasting copper pennies. I drive past camping areas and feel that same electric awareness, the sensation of being watched by patient, hungry eyes. The bone circles are out there somewhere, waiting for the next lost traveler to complete their pattern. Sometimes, when the light is just right and shadows fall in specific ways, I see the arrangements again. Not in the woods, but in everyday places. Scattered leaves on a sidewalk, fallen branches in a park, even dishes left in my sink. Perfect circles within circles, all pointing toward something my damaged mind can no longer comprehend. The woman was right about one thing. I am part of it now, connected to whatever force maintains those impossible structures. I can feel other lost souls being drawn toward dark places, their desperation creating invisible trails that lead to bone towers and surgical tables. I want to warn them, to break the pattern somehow, but the words won't come. They took that ability along with everything else they stole. All I can do is remember the taste of copper pennies and wait for the circles to claim me completely, because I know they will. Eventually, the pull will become too strong to resist, and I'll find myself driving down another unmarked forest road toward another clearing that shouldn't exist. This time, there won't be any search parties. No one left who cares enough to look. The bones need completion. The pattern must be maintained. And somewhere in the deep woods, the woman with no eyes is still working, her surgical precision unchanged by temporary setbacks. The tower will rise again, and the circles will guide new arrivals to their carefully arranged fate. I taste copper pennies and remember that I've been chosen. I taste copper pennies and wait for the fog to call me home.